You'd think losing a 30-room mansion would humble anyone, but when Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was ordered to leave Royal Lodge, he didn't step aside quietly. Instead, he hit back with a list of demands so bold that palace staff described it as a negotiation from another planet. And the more pressure he faced, the longer that list seemed to grow, turning what should have been a simple move out into one of the most bizarre standoffs inside the family in years. But what pushed him to take such a hard line? And what was really happening behind the scenes as his future home turned into a bargaining chip? The deeper you look, the stranger this story gets, and by the time we reach the end, you'll understand why this battle over bricks and mortar shook the family more than anyone expected. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next.
For more than 2 decades, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor treated Royal Lodge as his unshakable home base, a place he believed no one would ever take from him. He lived there with Sarah Ferguson, relying on a lease crafted under Queen Elizabeth II, a document so protective that insiders often called it ironclad. But that sense of security vanished overnight when King Charles issued a formal eviction notice. What should have been a quiet administrative decision instantly turned into something far more explosive and far more personal. At first, the public had no idea how intense the situation had become. The announcement seemed simple: new king, new priorities. But behind the scenes, staff whispered that Royal Lodge had slipped into a worrying state of neglect: cracked walls, peeling paint, and parts of the estate left to rot. And that raised a question no one dared ask out loud. Had the property fallen so far that even the lease couldn't protect it anymore? Charles wanted Royal Lodge back in working condition, not just for appearances, but for the future of the family's properties. Andrew, however, clung to his lease like a lifeline, determined to hold on to every legal inch he could. And this simmering tension set the stage for what would become one of the most unexpected twists in the entire saga. Because instead of retreating, Andrew began preparing something else entirely, a counteroffer that wasn't just bold, but staggering. And once he revealed what he wanted in return for leaving the estate, even some of his closest supporters were taken aback. The real shock wasn't that he refused to go quietly, it was what he demanded next.
Once Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor realized the eviction was inevitable, he didn't crumble under the pressure, he pivoted. And that's when the negotiations shifted from tense to astonishing. Instead of accepting whatever the king offered, Andrew came to the table with a list of demands so large, so specific, that staff inside the talks were stunned. The man losing a 31-room mansion wasn't downsizing, he was upgrading. The first demand alone raised eyebrows: a 6- or 7-bedroom home, not a cottage, not a temporary residence, but a full-scale property worthy of what he believed he was owed. And this wasn't some vague request. He wanted it ready, secured, and guaranteed before he agreed to leave Royal Lodge. But the house was only the beginning, because within days the list grew longer and stranger. Why was he suddenly insisting on so much? What did he know that others didn't? Next came the staffing expectations. According to sources close to the talks, Andrew insisted on a full household team: a cook, a gardener, a housekeeper, a driver, and even renewed police protection. To him, this wasn't extravagance, it was what he needed to live normally. But to those involved in the discussions, it felt like the negotiations were drifting far beyond what anyone expected. And insiders started wondering, was this a negotiation or a standoff designed to drag on indefinitely? Even his friends noticed the shift.
One confidant reportedly claimed Andrew had done exactly what was asked of him and simply wanted fairness in return. But fairness is subjective, and in this case, it depended entirely on who you asked. Because while his allies defended him, others, closer to the palace, saw it differently. One former courtier put it bluntly, this was always going to come down to money. And that wasn't just a casual comment, it hinted at a deeper truth about how far Andrew was willing to push this. What financial pressure was really driving these demands, and how much leverage did he think he had left? But the real twist came when insiders realized just how precise his requests were. Every clause, every condition, every non-negotiable item had to be combed over line by line. Some described it as exhausting, others described it as deliberate. Because, as the list grew, so did the tension. Why was Andrew haggling over every detail, and what was he trying to secure before everything slipped away?
As negotiations dragged on, insiders began whispering about something unexpected, the possibility that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor wasn't just looking for one new home, but two. It started as a quiet rumor, something only a few people dared to mention. But the more the talk stalled, the more it looked like there might be some truth to it, and that raised a critical question. Why would someone losing a massive mansion suddenly need multiple properties? The first of these rumored homes was Frogmore Cottage, the former residence of Harry and Meghan. To most people, it seemed like an odd choice, smaller, less private, and loaded with symbolism after everything that happened with the Sussexes. But Andrew reportedly saw it differently. To him, Frogmore wasn't about comfort, it was about leverage. And some insiders believe he wanted it precisely because it gave him more negotiating power than people realized. But what kind of long-term strategy involves Frogmore, and why was he so focused on it? Then came the second part of the rumor, the suggestion that Sarah Ferguson had her eye on Adelaide Cottage, previously home to the Prince and Princess of Wales. This wasn't about luxury, it was about proximity, reputation, and the stability she never quite found after leaving Royal Lodge. And while Sarah stayed mostly quiet, those who knew her well said she was watching the negotiations closely, waiting for her own outcome to unfold. But what did she know that the public didn't? And why was Adelaide Cottage so important to her future? With both rumoured homes floating in the background, something else happened behind the scenes. Andrew began pushing for a serious property on the King's Sandringham estate. Not a modest space, not a temporary fix, but a substantial home, one that matched the kind of lifestyle he believed he was still entitled to. Staff described the request as bold, advisors described it as tactical, because Sandringham wasn't just any estate. It was one of the few places where privacy, distance, and legacy aligned. So why did Andrew suddenly see Sandringham as his next stronghold, and what did it reveal about his mindset going forward? But here's where the story takes an even sharper turn. The more Andrew pushed, the more attention shifted onto Sarah Ferguson and her next move. Because while he fought for larger homes and more leverage, she faced a completely different reality, one that could take her somewhere almost no one expected. And that revelation would change the tone of the entire situation. While Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor fought for bigger homes and firmer guarantees, Sarah Ferguson's situation drifted in a completely different direction. She kept a low profile throughout the negotiations, rarely making public comments and avoiding anything that could escalate the tension. But behind the scenes, those close to her said she was bracing for a future that looked nothing like the life she'd known inside Royal Lodge, and the quiet way she handled it only made the speculation grow louder. The first rumor that caught people's attention was subtle. a whisper that she might not remain anywhere near Windsor once the move finally happened. Some insiders hinted she had no interest in returning to Frogmore or Adelaide Cottage if they were offered, preferring instead to carve out a space of her own. But what raised eyebrows was the suggestion that she might end up somewhere far smaller than expected. Why would someone accustomed to expansive estates suddenly consider something so modest? That question became even more intriguing when reports surfaced about a curious option, a renovated building on Princess Beatrice's Cotswolds estate, not a grand home, not a sprawling residence, but what some described as a former cattle shed, transformed into a quiet, private space. It sounded almost unbelievable to people who remembered her past life at Royal Lodge, yet the rumour persisted, and the tone around it hinted at something deeper. Was this move about downsizing or about distancing herself from the unfolding chaos around Andrew? But the biggest twist was still ahead, the one that revealed what this battle was truly about: money, leverage, and the power play shaping the monarchy's future.
By the time negotiations hit their final stages, it was clear this wasn't just about a house anymore. The entire situation had evolved into a quiet power struggle, a test of leverage, patience, and status inside a family trying to redefine itself under a new king. And Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, stripped of his old roles but not his determination, was standing his ground in ways few expected. The question was no longer if he would leave Royal Lodge, but how much he could secure before the final handover. Observers quickly noticed a recurring theme: money. Not in the public sense, but in the behind-the-scenes calculations shaping every move. Maintaining Royal Lodge had become expensive, and its disrepair only made things worse. Yet Andrew clung to his long-standing lease, knowing it was the strongest card he had left. Every clause in that contract held weight, and every legal detail gave him bargaining power. But what exactly did that lease protect, and why was the king forced to respect it, even as the situation escalated? The standoff deepened when Charles made one of his most decisive moves: the removal of Andrew's privately funded security in August 2024. This wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. By taking away a major financial cushion, Charles subtly increased the pressure, signaling that the era of unchecked privileges was over. But instead of backing down, Andrew used the shift as another leverage point to argue for the extensive staff and protections he claimed were essential. And insiders couldn't help but wonder, was this a negotiation or a long, calculated attempt to regain some of the influence he'd lost? Meanwhile, palace officials grew increasingly frustrated with the pace of the talks. Every detail seemed to require another round of discussion. Repairs, staffing, travel arrangements, security logistics, even the timeline for leaving Royal Lodge. Some insiders said the process felt endless, almost like Andrew was deliberately slowing things down, but others believed he was simply trying to secure a future that wouldn't leave him vulnerable. What did he fear would happen if he accepted a lesser offer? And what future was he trying so hard to protect? As the back and forth continued, another complication emerged: the public perception of the entire saga. The monarchy was already navigating a delicate moment, and the optics of a prolonged negotiation over luxury housing weren't ideal. Charles needed the situation resolved cleanly. Andrew needed stability, and somewhere in the middle, a complicated agreement began to take shape. One insiders described as a buyout, not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that concessions were being traded for a peaceful transition out of Royal Lodge. But what concessions were made behind the scenes, and what did each side consider a fair price? Yet despite the complexity, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't a simple eviction. It was the beginning of a new reality, one where old protections no longer guaranteed old privileges, and every member of the family had to confront the changing expectations of a new reign. Andrew was fighting for a future that looked as close to his past as possible. Charles was shaping a future that looked nothing like the one before it. And in that clash, a deeper truth began to surface, one that would ripple through the family long after the final agreement was reached. Because beneath the property debates, staffing demands, and quiet negotiations, the real story was about control. Who had it, who lost it, and who was determined to reclaim it. And understanding that shift is the key to understanding what happens next.
If you want to follow every new development the moment it happens, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always be the first to know when another story breaks wide open. And trust me, the next chapter in this saga is already unfolding. Thanks for watching and stay tuned. There's a lot more coming.